trying to make some videos in advance of my wife and I expecting a baby, just in case I can't be here and there's no substitute. If you have a substitute, defer to them in terms of how they navigate things, but you should be pretty set with your routines. You know how to work the biweekly documents, how I post things. It's been pretty much the same all year. But it'd be awesome if you had a teacher to step in and facilitate some groups and some breakouts with this, because otherwise you just got a video of me talking. That said, thank you for hanging in. I'll share my screen and progress through the slides, play a couple of videos. We would be interacting with all of that in the chat, so it won't be quite as interactive. We won't have as much conversation going, but the content or the information will still be there and give you something to start with for the biweekly document. So we've been talking about these colonists being successful and spreading out. And I want to build on that idea and say that we've kind of oversimplified it to begin with, because all I've said is, yeah, they settle in these two spaces, Virginia and New England. Over time, they're successful and they spread out. We haven't really gotten into the how that's possible. And one of the struggles that this group has initially is agriculture. They're trying to practice agriculture like the image in the upper right, where they're planting things in rows and spreading out, trying to cultivate land and then have livestock. And these things are doable. Not in Europe. Things that need to be planted and how that planting is done are very different. And there are also these colonists watching an indigenous population practicing a system of agriculture that they don't necessarily understand. So all the way on the far left, you have three things planted together: corn, beans, and squash. Those three plants, those three crops work together to make each other grow more efficiently. Corn grows in the center of this picture, with beans growing around them, like wrapped, going upward, because beans grow on a vine. And then around the perimeter, there's squash. The squash provides shade to prevent other plants from coming in and competing, but squash is very depleting of soil and needs something like beans to be grown in the same space to replenish that soil with the nutrients it needs. Corn is also harsh on soil as well, but it's providing for the beans by growing upwards. So like the three of them are working together to make each other grow more effectively. This is a much more modern practice of agriculture, to rotate crops and plant things in cycles, but not something that Europeans were doing. And they really didn't understand what they were seeing when indigenous populations were doing things like this. So a combination of ignorance, like they didn't really know, and then a little bit of arrogance to be sure that they thought that their system was just better because they thought of themselves as being better and more entitled to the space. So they're not really applying what they're seeing from the indigenous populations, but yet they're struggling to figure out what they should be doing as well. Eventually they're going to move into something known as cash crops. I'm going to play a video that dives into the intricacies of what that looks like shortly. But when they're producing these cash crops are not necessarily a food group or like a thing that people are eating. They're things that are grown for the purposes of selling them. And potentially to be turning them into something else. So like cotton would be an example of a cash crop. It's a plant, something that grows in the ground, just like a food, like you pour water on the seeds and like the sun and it grows. The thing that's yielded from it though is not something that we eat. We don't eat cotton balls, but they are still valuable and can be turned into a finished product, which is like an example of this idea of a cash crop or the raw materials. Almost anything that's a cash crop is labor intensive. And we've seen already that colonists that are settling in the space in North America, many of them are dying. And then additionally, many of them are not, they need more people than there are there. They're actively trying to recruit and get people to come join them from England. But that process is slow moving. And in the meantime, these people owe money back to people in England who sponsored them to get there. And so their solution is cash crops, and the labor force that they need is going to be provided or forcibly provided with slave labor from the African continent, specifically the region of West Africa. The majority of the slaves who are forcibly brought from Africa are coming from this region, like this edge portion that's further out into the Atlantic. And we'll dive into some of the specifics as to why, because they didn't just provide labor, they also provide knowledge, which we'll we'll build on through this period. This image of a triangle is a little bit oversimplified. Produced in America, and they're taken to Europe where they're going to be turned into a finished product, and slaves are going to be moved from Africa and brought to the Americas. Like, that's true, but it's a little bit oversimplified because there's hundreds of thousands of ships and people moving around the Atlantic Ocean at the same time. And that it's not just a one direction triangle going from continent to continent, that these ships and these people are moving around the Atlantic Ocean in a multitude of different directions. And the idea of a single triangle is a little bit less correct. It's a little bit better to think about it as like a web of triangles, like this image here, where there's multiple overlaid on top of one another on one map. And in that process, there are things that are going to be moved unintentionally as well, which we'll build on. Come back to this image. I would have you responding to this video in the chat. So if you wanted to take some brief note for yourself, it doesn't necessarily need to be something that you're going to turn in, but just to keep yourself following along with this. And again, if you have a substitute or a teacher who's there, you can talk through it with them as well. So looking for 3 resources produced in each of these regions. That's again to try to help you keep track of what's going on here through the video. The main focus though being that you're looking at how did each of these regions benefit from triangle trade. I'm gonna stop my share and make sure that I've got the sound shared. Yes. So focusing in on that second question more than the first, but the first will guide you there.
So when talking about the different regions of colonial America, we divide the colonies up into 3 sections: New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. So let's start to the north in New England. New England consists of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. There was no Vermont yet, and Maine at this point was considered part of Massachusetts. Colonists in New England had to deal with extremely cold winters. While the land along the coast was flat, inland was very hilly and mountainous, and this, combined with a rocky soil, made farming difficult in New England. However, the cold did reduce the spread of disease. Because of the cold climate and bad soil, New England farms were small. Therefore, New Englanders relied on other businesses to make money, such as furs, shipbuilding, fishing, and trading. Timber was desperately needed by England to build ships, homes, furniture, and other goods, and New England had vast forests. New Englanders also often looked to the sea for sources of income and developed an extensive fishing industry that still exists today. Whale oil was a valuable commodity. It was used in lamps and soaps, and Nantucket and other fishing communities developed large whaling businesses. For the most part, the colonists relied on English imports of finished goods, such as glass, linens, paint, and household items, and New Englanders prospered off the Atlantic trading network. What historians refer to as the triangular trade developed between England, Africa, the Caribbean, and North America, as mostly raw materials flowed from the colonies to Europe or England, and slaves and manufactured goods were shipped to the colonies. Boston, New England's largest city, greatly benefited from the triangular trade, developing into a major shipping and trading port. Because New England never developed the large, spread-out farms found in the rest of the colonies, the people there lived closer to each other and had much more social interactions centered around towns. The church was central to New England life. We discussed the strict religious rules and persecution put in place by the Puritans of Massachusetts in a previous video. And while the other New England colonies enjoyed more religious freedom than Massachusetts, there was much less religious tolerance in New England than in the other regions of the 13 colonies. Because of their close proximity, town meetings became an important part of governing local communities. These meetings, while existing in other regions, were especially important in New England in establishing a tradition of self-government and democracy. We will look closer at governing in the colonies in the next video, but remember town meetings in New England as being an especially important part of their social and political makeup. We will also be looking at how England tried to maintain its grip on this growing importance of North American trade. England passed laws such as the Navigation Acts, which mandated that only British ships could trade with the colonies and that all exports had to travel through English ports, in essence blocking their European rivals like France and the Netherlands out of lucrative trade with the colonies. After all, it wasn't just the New England colonies that were taking part in the Atlantic trade network. It was the middle colonies as well. The middle colonies consisted of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, the middle colonies had a much better climate and soil for farming than their neighbors in New England, so farming was a much bigger part of their economy. The Middle Colonies region was known as the breadbasket of the colonies for the large amount of grains they produced. However, the Middle Colonies also contained the two largest cities in America at the time, Philadelphia and New York, which were centers for trade and manufacturing. Of the three regions, the Middle Colonies had the most diverse economy, with its mix of farm goods and manufacturing goods such as paper, textiles, and iron. Craftsmen such as blacksmiths, silversmiths, and cobblers or shoemakers played an important role in the economies of towns and cities of the Middle Colonies. New York and Philadelphia were busy ports, and shipping and trade were lucrative businesses that helped produce more industries in the Middle Colonies. These busy ports shipped the wheat, grains, and oats produced by local farmers to Europe, the Caribbean, and other colonies. Now, it wasn't just the economy that was diverse in the Middle Colonies. As we mentioned in a previous video, the Middle Colonies, led by the example of Quaker William Penn, were much more religiously tolerant of different faiths. And as a result, Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and Lutherans settled in the Middle Colonies. This religious diversity attracted settlers from many different European countries. So in addition to the English, the Middle Colonies had a population made up of Germans, Dutch, Scots-Irish, Swedish, and French. So when you think of the Middle Colonies, think of a diverse place, both in population and in economics. Below the middle region were the southern colonies, made up of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The southern colonies enjoyed a warm climate with mild winters. With its coastal plains, long growing season, and ideal soil, life in the southern colonies was centered around large farms. Of course, its hot climate also brought with it rampant disease. Religion, while important in the South, did not play the central role that it did in the North, and religious tolerance was more widespread in the South, especially compared to New England. Southerners were much more spread out from each other, limiting their social interactions, as life often revolved around plantations and large farms. The Southern economy was built on what are referred to as cash crops, such as tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, and sugarcane. Tobacco was one of the first cash crops grown in the colonies, dating back to the first North American colony, Jamestown, Virginia. Tobacco and other cash crops required large amounts of labor, and in 1619, a Dutch vessel brought the first 20 slaves into Jamestown. At the time, many settlers came to America as indentured servants who had their passage paid in exchange for working off the price of their ticket to the New World for a certain length of time. However, slavery soon provided much of the labor in the South.
So again, trying to focus our attention not just on the things that are being produced in each of these regions, but conceptually how all of these regions are benefiting from this system. So even though most of this enslaved population is going to these southern colonies, they're all really benefiting from its existence. At its core, the success that these groups are going to have and leading them to eventually declaring themselves independent is really rooted in the success of that system. These groups complain to the king about restricting their trade, and that trade really is rooted in the existence of slavery. These colonies will not be successful without the existence of slavery, and they won't eventually declare themselves independent had slavery not existed in them. They needed that in order to get to the point that they would be expanding outward, and generating these ideas and understandings of themselves as no longer being English, but maybe being something different. That and how this triangle training works, but it really leaves out a large portion of the human experience of what it meant to be enslaved or to be forcefully moved from one continent to the other for the exclusive purpose of supporting others, and not at your own will and will. It's the same another video in the same respond in the chat and but again,
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed. leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day.
Again, I would have you like respond and discuss in the chat, and then we would do the same thing out loud. Again, if you've got a sub or another teacher here to guide you through that, that'd be fantastic. You'd go through these 3 questions, mainly dealing with the massive shortage of labor in North America to produce cash crops. All of those manufactured goods that are being produced in Europe are then used in turn to trade African kings for more slaves. The video does an excellent job of noting that the slaves that are being taken are from rival groups within the region of West Africa, that these groups are now competing with one another that are there to take on more prisoners, to go to war against one another, because if they can take more slaves, they can take on trade for more weapons and more, and then assert more control over these other groups. So they're like competing against one another in a pretty endless spiral. And that's really leading to like continued conflict in that region. As much as these groups of slaves are being forced to provide labor, I want to build on this and say that when they're moving to this space in Virginia or further south into North or South Carolina, they're moving into a space that Europeans really don't know what they're doing in terms of farming. And these Europeans are not interested in farming like the indigenous populations that are there. And the solution that they come to over time on the backs of slave labor is pictured here. These 2 regions pictured here are actually not of the same place. One of them is from modern day Senegal, the one in the upper left, and the one in the lower right is from modern day South Carolina. And both of these, though 4,000 plus miles apart, are rice fields. Rice is the solution in this region for a few reasons. One, it grows really well in a space where there's a lot of water, which there is, and grows really well in humid environments, which the southern United States or these southern colonies are. It doesn't spoil, and it's really ideal for moving things around, go back a couple of slides, around an Atlantic world. That if there are hundreds of thousands of ships sailing back and forth across the Atlantic, rice is an excellent food to use for feeding people on board ships and people who are on the move, because it doesn't take very much to fill someone up, and it doesn't spoil. The space in Virginia, super well suited to it. And it's something that is going to really lead to the success of these southern colonies. The video is referencing some other cash crops, tobacco, eventually cotton, but rice is pretty central to the success of the Carolinas and in turn to these southern colonies. And it's not something that existed in North America prior to Europeans or slaves bringing them to this space, or enslaved Africans, I should say. They're not Europeans, or specifically Portuguese traders who are moving slaves, brought rice with them purposefully as a food source and something that they intended to plant, or whether slaves would have brought it themselves or hidden it in their enforced bondage, like they're going to North America and they're bringing food with them or hoping that when they get there they'll have something to eat or be able to plant. But either way, the fact that slaves from specific regions of West Africa were prized by people who are buying slaves in North America gives us some evidence that this is something that was super critical for them to have. It's really not just about their labor that's being provided, it's their knowledge. West African slaves did more than just provide the muscle and manpower or physical human power to produce these raw materials, but instead that the knowledge that they had about how to grow rice, because that's something that exists in the wild and then was cultivated by human beings in Africa for thousands of years before Europeans took Africans to North America, is to say that they did more than just provide the labor. There's more to it than that. And the success of these colonies and the eventual process of them spreading out and declaring themselves independent because they're mad that this king is restricting their trade is only possible because slaves brought specific knowledge about the region and how to grow rice in it and the labor for it. Your asynchronous work that you'll swing into with this video being complete is on your new biweekly document, biweekly number 6. It's a sort of lengthy article, but it's only 7 questions. It's spaced out quite a bit too. So when it says 7 pages, 8 pages, don't get discouraged. It's really 7 because the bottom one is just citations. I'm hoping that it's a reasonable amount of work for you to wrap up post video and then into the afternoon session. Thank you for hanging in on another video, and yeah, best of luck.